On a November morning in 1895, an 18-year-old girl sat alone behind a locked door while a footman stood guard outside it, and wept until her eyes were swollen shut. Hours later, a veil hid the swelling as she was married to a duke she did not love. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and she was not the only one. Across 40 years, hundreds of American heiresses crossed the ocean to buy a title with their father's money. One vanished into a cold Scottish castle. One died at 36 in a locked room, a photograph pressed into her hand. One watched a beautiful husband burn $10 million on a pink marble palace and the parties around it. One married the son of another American bride and lived to see a single coronet swallow 2 fortunes and send a duke to prison. Every one of them was told she was buying something that would last. Which of them was right? If you love the stories the Gilded Age kept behind its ballroom doors, subscribe and stay with me. This one runs long, and every woman in it pays a different price. Chapter 1. They bought the rank, New York denied them. In the ballrooms of Gilded Age, New York, a family could own a railroad and still be turned away at the door, and a whole generation of daughters learned the lesson early. The money was real. The mines and the rail lines and the dry goods empires threw off fortunes that would have staggered a European prince. And still the oldest drawing rooms in Manhattan kept their velvet cords drawn tight against it. To have made a fortune was, in that world, faintly disqualifying. The people who mattered had inherited theirs, and they guarded the difference with a cruelty all the more effective for going unspoken. A name was a possession the older families still held over the newly rich, and no amount of fresh gold could mint one. The gatekeeper was a woman the whole city knew simply as Mrs. Astor. She presided over New York society, and with the help of a social arbiter named Ward McAllister, she decided exactly who belonged and who did not. McAllister gave the exclusion its famous number. He declared that the people worth knowing amounted to 400, and in 1892, he published the list. He sorted the city into 2 tribes. The nobs were the old families, secure in blood and time. The swells were the new arrivals, rich beyond counting, and, for that very reason, watched and measured and quietly kept at arm's length. A girl could be beautiful, clever, and richer than half the 400 combined, and none of it would buy her a place among them, because the one thing her father's money could not purchase in New York was rank. It could purchase rank elsewhere. Across the Atlantic sat an entire class that owned rank and almost nothing else, and the timing of their need was exact. From the 1870s, a long agricultural depression rolled over Britain, and the cause of it was, with a certain irony, American. Cheap prairie grain came flooding across the ocean by rail and steamship, in greater quantity and at a lower price than English soil could ever answer, and it broke the market for wheat. The rents that had funded the great estates for centuries fell with it. The men who held the titles still held the land, the parks, the long galleries, and the ancient names carved above their doors, but the income that kept it all standing was draining away year upon year. They were land-rich and cash-poor, and the stately homes that were their glory had become stone weights they could no longer afford to carry. 2 hungers faced each other across one ocean. On the American side, daughters with fortunes and no rank. On the British side, sons with rank and no fortune. The daughter wanted the single thing her country would not sell her, and the son wanted the single thing his country had run clean out of. It did not take long for the 2 to find each other, and once they had, the traffic between them became a genuine economy, organized and frank about its terms. There was even a directory. Titled Americans first appeared in 1890, associated with a man named Chauncey Depew, and it functioned, without embarrassment, as a catalogue of goods. It listed the eligible unmarried peers of Europe, their titles, their estates, and their reputed incomes, so that an ambitious mother could study the field the way a breeder studies a stud book before settling a match. The mothers were the deal-makers of this economy, and the shrewdest of them worked the London season like a trading floor. London-based American matrons, women such as Minnie Stevens, made careers of brokering the introductions and steering the bargains that turned a debutante and a duke into a marriage. None of it was hidden. The terms were discussed over tea and settled by lawyers, and the newspapers on both shores reported the sums like the closing prices of a market, which, in every sense that mattered, is what they were. The law made the stakes plain. Under the old English doctrine of coverture, a wife's property had for centuries passed, upon marriage, straight into the hands of her husband, her money becoming his to spend as he pleased. Britain had begun to loosen that grip with the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882. But no American father trusted an Act of Parliament with a fortune he had spent his life building. So the father's lawyers built walls of their own. They drew up elaborate marriage settlements and trusts meant to channel the money carefully, to fence off a portion of it, to guarantee the daughter an income her husband could not simply pour away. It had the look of protection. In the main, it protected the wrong thing. The settlements guarded the income on paper, while the purpose of the money, its whole reason for crossing the ocean, was to rescue the husband's crumbling house. The dollars went to the roofs and the debts and the rent arrears. They did not, in the end, go to the women. Edith Wharton, who watched all of this from the inside, had a sharper word for these girls. She called them buccaneers. In her telling, they were raiders who crossed an ocean, stormed a citadel, and took what they wanted with their eyes wide open. It is the truer word. They and their mothers bought their way in, and the thing they bought was a coronet, the small jewelled circlet that marked the rank New York had denied them. The coronet was a receipt. It was proof of a purchase, an object a woman could wear on her head to show the world exactly what her father's fortune had bought her. And unlike the money itself, it could never be sneered at, because it was rank made visible. The name the era finally settled on these women, the Dollar Princess, came late, from a Viennese operetta of 1907, a label arriving only after the marriages it described. The prototype had come early, and everyone in the trade knew her name. In 1874, an American girl named Jenny Jerome married Lord Randolph Churchill and carried a dowry of £50,000 and a yearly allowance across the water, and in due course she gave England a son named Winston. She showed the shape of the thing a full generation before the words "Dollar Princess" were ever coined. After her, the traffic thickened season by season, until in a single year, 1895, 9 American daughters married titled Englishmen, among them a duke, an earl, and 3 barons, as though the whole marriage market had struck the same bargain at once. The season that made these matches ran on a calendar as fixed as the sailing schedules. In summer, the families gathered at Newport, on the Rhode Island shore, where the new fortunes built their marble cottages and competed by the yard of frontage and the count of servants. In spring, they crossed to the London season, timed to Parliament and to the presentations at court, where a well-drilled daughter could be shown to the eligible peerage in the 6 weeks that mattered. Between the two lay the ocean, and the ocean was crossed with a purpose. The scale is easy to underestimate. Between 1870 and 1914, English heritage counts 102 American women who married into the British peerage alone, among them 6 who married dukes, and the wider field of titled Europeans runs to several hundred more. By 1915, the marriage directory had tallied 454 American women wedded into the aristocracy of Europe. By the close of the century, a quarter of the House of Lords carried some American connection in the family. The total sum that crossed the ocean this way can only be estimated, and the estimates are soft, running from something near £1 billion poured into British hands to a figure someplace, in today's money, as high as $25 billion. Whatever the true amount, it was a river of American gold flowing east to hold up the houses of men who could no longer hold them up themselves. For a picture of the market at its coldest, there is one wedding the whole era remembers. On the 6th of November 1895, in a church on Fifth Avenue, an heiress named Consuelo Vanderbilt was married to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, in a match her mother Alva had engineered against the girl's will. Consuelo spent the morning of her wedding weeping alone behind a locked door, a footman posted outside so that not even her governess could reach her, and by the time she was married, a veil hid her swollen eyes. Her Vanderbilt fortune went east to save Blenheim Palace, the near-bankrupt Marlborough seat, and Blenheim stands today in all its vast splendour. She is the cruelest image the age has to offer, the coerced extreme, and she is not the subject of this story. Set her aside. She is the ghost against whom the others are measured, the women who walked to the altar willingly, certain they had made a fine bargain. The bargain took the same shape over and over across 40 years. The money did its work. It wired the cold castles, paid the debts, and saved the ancient houses from the auctioneer, and the houses, once saved, went on standing. What the money could not do was preserve the woman who brought it. That was the quiet arithmetic underneath every settlement, the line no lawyer could strike out. The house would outlive the woman who paid for it. Not every one of them ended in tears behind a veil. The first woman in this story chose her husband freely, wanted him, and won, by the measure of the 4 who follow her, something close to a happy ending. Her name was May Goelet, and she was the richest young heiress in New York. She could have had, and turned away, half the princes of Europe. What she bought with her fortune was a quiet Scottish soldier, and one of the largest inhabited castles in Britain. And hers is the deal that came closest to working. It is the gentlest cost in this whole account, which is the only reason to begin with it. Everything after her runs darker. Chapter 2. The richest girl trades New York for a castle. May Goelet could have married almost any prince in Europe, and the strange thing about her story is that she chose the quiet man and meant it. The newspapers had spent years marrying her off. They engaged her, on paper, to princes of Teck and Hohenlohe, to Grand Duke Boris Romanov of Russia, and to an earlier Duke of Manchester so buried in debt that he announced the match before she had said a single word to accept it. By the count of the day, some 20 suitors came and went, most of them titled, most of them poor, drawn by the arithmetic behind her. She was petite and dark, and by every account, very clever, admired for her taste and her intelligence more than for any flash. She had been raised half American and half European, and she could have had almost any coronet in the marriage market of her age. That refusal of every crown but one is the truest thing about her. But the crowns came for a reason, and the reason was the money. Her father was Ogden Goelet, and the Goelet fortune was built on the one thing in New York that never stopped rising: Manhattan itself. In 1879, Ogden and his brother Robert inherited a real estate empire of 259 houses worth some $40 million together, a fortune second in the city only to the Astors. The family genius was patience. They held their land and let a growing city pay them, year after year, for the right to stand on it. Ogden spent the way a man of his rank was expected to spend. He had Richard Morris Hunt raise Ochre Court at Newport, a 50-room French chateau kept up by 27 house servants, 8 coachmen and grooms, and 12 gardeners. He kept a box at the Metropolitan Opera and a steam yacht 300 feet long, named the Mayflower. May's mother was one of the marrying Wilsons, a clan whose particular talent was rising by marriage into Vanderbilt money and Astor money, which made May a niece of Grace Wilson Vanderbilt and one thread in the web that tied half of moneyed New York together. The wound in the story arrives early, and it arrives at sea. On the 27th of August, 1897, Ogden Goelet died aboard the Mayflower in the harbour at Cowes, on the south coast of England, with the personal physician of the Prince of Wales at his bedside. The American Land King expired off a foreign shore, tended by the future king's own doctor, and his daughter, not yet 19, became one of the great heiresses of her generation almost overnight. His residuary estate, roughly $30 million, went into trust. At 21, May came into $500,000 outright and $10 million more held in trust, with half of that vast residue due to her when her mother died. Across her whole life, her inheritance would come to something near $28 million. At her wedding, the world was told the dowry was some $20 million, which is about $740 million in the money of today. The newspapers, never satisfied, went further and crowned her the richest unmarried woman in the United States, worth $125 million in her own right. That last figure was pure legend, the kind of number the Age printed because its readers wanted it to be true. The real one was smaller and still staggering. In the autumn of 1903, the New York Sun called her life the life of a 20th century fairy princess, and for once, the paper was not exaggerating. For half a decade, the courtship of May Goelet was a transatlantic sport. She spent her seasons in London and on the Riviera as much as in New York, and wherever she went, the eligible and impoverished nobility of Europe arranged itself in her path. This was the machinery of the era, working exactly as designed. On one side of the ocean sat old titles with empty treasuries, the rents of their estates gutted by cheap grain shipped in from the American prairie. On the other sat American fortunes shut out of the oldest drawing rooms at home by the plain fact of being new. A coronet bought the one thing that even Goelet millions could not buy in Manhattan, which was rank that no one could question. May had the millions and could take her pick of the coronets, and she was in no hurry. She turned them down, one after another, for years. Then she chose a soldier. The man she accepted was Henry, the 8th Duke of Roxburgh, born in 1876, a dutiful and unshowy officer of the Royal Horse Guards, who happened to own one of the largest inhabited castles in Scotland. He was a reserved man, more at home on a riverbank than in a ballroom, master of a house called Floors above the River Tweed. He proposed in 1903 off New York during the yacht races for the America's Cup, and she took him and refused everyone else. Whatever the marriage market had made of her, this was a plain trade entered freely on both sides. A New York fortune raised on Manhattan land, exchanged for an ancient Scottish dukedom and a cold castle in the borders. And, rarest of all in this whole procession of bargains, a husband the record says she genuinely wanted. The wedding was one of the spectacles of the age. They married on the 10th of November, 1903, at St. Thomas's Church on Fifth Avenue. A death in the family had cut the reception down to some 250 guests, but nothing could cut down the crowd in the street. May wore white satin cut by the House of Worth in Paris, and above the orange blossom of her bridal coronet she wore, against a fortune in gifts, no jewellery at all, save a single string of pearls. Those gifts came to more than $1 million on their own. There was the Roxburgh Emerald Collection, 200 years old. There was a diamond tiara, whose setting alone the House of Boucheron had billed at 300,000 francs, and another said to have come down from the crown jewels of Louis XVI. From her Wilson grandparents came a rope of pearls several yards long. The coronet on her head was, in the plainest sense, a receipt, proof of what one of America's great fortunes had bought, and of what it had promised to give in return. There is something almost too fitting about the pearls. They were the one thing she chose to wear, alone, against all the diamonds and emeralds heaped around her. And a pearl is a thing the sea makes slowly and gives up reluctantly. It was the sea, 6 years earlier and an ocean away, that had taken her father off cows. She walked to the altar wearing the ocean's slow work at her throat, on her way to trade an American fortune for a life on the far side of that same water. Outside, New York lost its manners. Women who could not get near the doors climbed down through manhole covers and coal chutes to come up inside the church and glimpse her. The avenue filled and then jammed solid. When her carriage came, it could barely move for the press of bodies, and as it stalled, the people closed around it, and hands began to come in through the windows, reaching for her, straining to lay a finger on the white satin of her gown. Hold on that picture, because it is the whole of the bargain in a single frame. The richest young woman in America, in Paris, satin and one strand of pearls, halted in a stopped carriage outside St. Thomas's, while strangers who had crawled through coal chutes to see her pushed their arms through the glass to touch her dress. When the ceremony ended and she was gone, the crowd went into the church and stripped it bare of every flower. On the surface, it was a triumph, and it looked like the one bargain in this long story of bargains that came out even. She had wanted a title, and she had bought the oldest kind, a Scottish dukedom that no quantity of New York money could otherwise reach. She had wanted the man, and she had him. The fortune was real, the affection was real, the castle was real, and now hers. Every column of the ledger balanced. What the ledger did not show was the castle itself, waiting for her at the end of a long northern road, and the 10 years of silence waiting for her inside it. Chapter 3. 10 years of waiting in the dark. The castle she arrived at had no electric light, and for the first decade it gave her no child either. Flore's Castle stands above the River Tweed in the Scottish borders, one of the largest inhabited houses in the country, and in 1903 it was, for all its scale, a dim and cold place. The woman who walked into it had grown up in the warmth and glare of another world entirely. She had moved between 608 Fifth Avenue and the Newport season, between Nice and London, in rooms lit for company and built to be filled with it, always among people, always quick, always at the centre. Then she married a homebody, and the homebody's home was a stone castle in the far north with no wires in its walls. She had it electrified in 1904, inside a year of arriving, which tells its own small story about the distance between the life she had left and the one she had bought. What she did to Floors across the decades that followed was, in the end, the most lasting thing she ever did. She set about turning the castle into something a person could live inside. She knocked through walls to hang tapestries. She had the heavy Victorian ceilings taken down and the rooms made lighter and more Georgian. And after her mother died in 1929 and the last of the Goelet inheritance came to her, she carried the family's treasures north across the ocean and set them into a Scottish castle. Into those cold border rooms went 17th century tapestries from the Gobelins and Brussels looms. The Triumph of the Gods set hung in 1930. furniture from the reign of Louis XV, Sèvres porcelain, a Savonnerie carpet woven for the Gallery of Apollo in the Louvre, a carpet made for the dining room of Louis XV at Fontainebleau, a piece made for the apartments of the Comtesse d'Artois at Versailles. One history of the age says it flatly: her fortune, near $28 million, ensured the future of floors. The rooms that visitors buy a ticket to see today are, in their substance, her rooms, furnished with the earnings of Manhattan land. The story goes that she had the old Victorian furniture she tore out dragged into the park before the castle and burned in a bonfire, though that tale belongs to the castle guides and cannot be confirmed. It would be a simpler story if the woman in that castle were miserable, and the record will not allow it. By every serious account, the marriage was a good one, among the happiest of all the transatlantic matches of the era. Anne de Courcy, who has studied these marriages closely, calls May a real-life version of the contented Lady Cora of the great house dramas. She was older when she married, de Courcy says, so it was much more of a love match. She knew that they would get on, and they did. The biographer Matt Thompson reaches instead for temperament. "I think they brought out the best in each other," he says. She was very extroverted and wanted to be out all the time. He was more of a homebody, and he made her appreciate the comforts of home, and she brought him out of his shell a little bit. What Henry hated about the wedding was its publicity, the crawling crowds and the grabbing hands, not the woman he was marrying. And yet the affection is only half the ledger, and the other half is quieter and harder to look at. May had traded a whole cosmopolitan world for one house at the end of a long road, in a country not her own, among people she had not grown up beside. Consuelo Vanderbilt, who knew that world from the inside, is said to have summed up May's life as a duchess in 3 words: needlework, salmon fishing, and bridge. It was meant, perhaps, as plain description. It reads now like a cage, with the door standing open. This was a clever, restless woman, whose days had narrowed to embroidery, the card table, and the salmon in the river, in the long dark of a foreign winter. Beneath even that ran the deepest of the silences. The whole public purpose of the marriage, the reason such matches existed at all, was continuity. An heir, a name carried forward, a line made secure. And for 10 years, there was no child. A decade of that expectation in a house built to be inherited is its own kind of exile. And the record does not tell what those years cost her, because May left almost nothing behind in her own voice. A verified word from her about any of it is very hard to find. The one voice that survives from inside the marriage is his. The heir came at last on the 7th of September, 1913. A son, George, with King George V standing as his godfather. 10 years after the wedding, the house finally had what it had been built to wait for. The next year, the war came, and part of floors was given over as a convalescent hospital for wounded officers, the staterooms May had made with such care filling up with iron beds. Henry went to the front. In October of 1914, he wrote to her from a field dressing station, and the letter is the nearest surviving thing to the private weather of their marriage. "I've just got into a field dressing station, having got knocked over this morning," he told her. "It's not a bad wound. Grazed my left testicle and went through my left thigh, missing the artery." And then, without any change of tone, the coldest line a wife could read. "Yesterday I did well killing a German with my sword. He lived. He came home to the wired castle, the son, and the woman whose money had bought all of it. May outlived Henry, who died in 1932, by 5 years. She died in London on the 26th of April, 1937, aged 58, and was carried north to be buried in the Roxburgh plot at Kelso, close to the river and the house she had spent a life remaking. The house would outlive the woman who paid for it. Floors still stands, still the seat of the Dukes of Roxburgh, at the centre of an estate of some 60,500 acres. Its doors open to anyone with the price of a ticket, its finest rooms substantially hers. Through her son, the Goelet blood runs straight into the present dukedom. Decades on, a prince would even propose to his bride in those very rooms, which only underlines the plain fact of it. The house her dollars saved is still alive, and the woman is not. Set against every woman still to come in this story, May Goelet is the one whose bargain came nearest to whole. Her money bought her a house she could actually live in, and a marriage she could actually bear. And of all these American brides, she is the closest any of them came to winning. Hers is the variation, the version of the deal that very nearly worked. The price was exile and a decade of waiting in the dark, and it was a real price, and she paid it and survived it. The next woman would love her husband far more than May ever loved hers, would give him everything she had, and where May paid a decade, she would pay with the whole of her life. Chapter 4. A poor politician needs a fortune. Mary Leiter loved George Curzon from across a London ballroom, and he, by his own later admission, did not yet love her back when he took her money. That single asymmetry, one heart full and one heart calculating, is the whole tragedy in miniature. And everything that follows, the empire and the marble and the early grave, unwinds from it. She was Mary Victoria Leiter of Chicago, born in the spring of 1870, and the fortune that made her marriageable had been pulled, quite literally, out of a fire. Her father was Levi Ziegler Leiter, who had come up from nothing, a clerk on a wage of $400 a year, of which the story goes that he saved half by sleeping in the store. Then, in October of 1871, Chicago burned. When the fire had gone out and the ash had cooled, Levi Leiter walked the ruined center of the city and bought up the best sites while they were still cluttered with charred timbers, and he was right about nearly every one of them. By the time he died in 1904, he was worth $30 million. His old partner, Marshall Field, left more than $100 million. Both men had started with nothing at all. That is the money the London ballrooms could smell on Mary Leiter before they ever heard her speak, and they smelled it first. She was tall for her day, close to 5 feet 8 inches, and she moved in a way that people who saw it groped after words to describe, calling it floating, undulating, swan-like. Curzon himself said afterward that it was her walk that first caught him, the whole length of a crowded room away. She had come out in Washington in 1888, had charmed the young First Lady Frances Cleveland into friendship, and had been admired on 2 continents. But she carried the fault line of her whole class inside her, the thing her biographer put most plainly, that a girl of new Chicago money was always read first as money, and only then as a face. She had a grace that ran past her looks, and the record keeps one small proof of it. At a Washington ball, so a newspaper of the day told it, she saw a plain girl left alone and unnoticed in a corner, and she quietly steered a partner across the room to carry the forgotten girl a bouquet and a little attention, a kindness done so lightly that people remembered it for years. That was the woman underneath the fortune. The fortune, for its part, was not quite as bottomless as the ballrooms imagined. Her brother Joseph, in 1898, tried to corner the entire American wheat market and failed so completely that the losses were reckoned at some $10 million, which his father Levi had to make good, and for a season, society whispered that the Leiters were ruined. They were not, but the whisper alone was a reminder of what new money truly was. A thing that could vanish as fast as it had come. A thing that made a title, which could never be lost at cards or cornered in a market, look all the safer by comparison. The man she fixed on read her exactly that way, at least at the start. George Nathaniel Curzon was everything the Leiter fortune was not: ancient in name, English to the bone, dazzlingly clever, and poor. He had brains that unsettled other clever men, and an ambition that would in the end consume him, and he had almost no money to fund either. His income before he married came to about £1,500 a year, which for a man who meant to govern was very close to nothing. Mary first saw him at a London ball in 1890. What followed was a siege, conducted by a woman who had already decided. For nearly 3 years, she waited on him. She turned away other suitors, some of them titled, all of them far richer than the penniless politician she wanted. And she said nothing in public, because he had said nothing to her. When at last he did propose, it was in Paris, and even then he made her keep it secret while he went off to do the thing that mattered to him more than she did. A hard and genuinely dangerous journey through the mountains of the Pamirs in Central Asia. She waited for that too. She told those closest to her that if he died out there among the passes, she would never marry another man as long as she lived, but would go into a convent. That is the measure of the thing on her side. There is no matching measure on his. Because the love, at the beginning, ran one way only, and how this is known matters, because it is the hinge of everything after. Curzon's biographer, Nigel Nicholson, who read the private letters that survive on both sides, weighed them, and reached a judgment he took pains to hedge. If he had read the evidence correctly, Nicholson wrote, Curzon did not love Mary deeply when he proposed to her, nor even when he married her, and, in Nicholson's phrase, the fullness of his love came only later, in India. What Curzon saw when he looked at Mary Leiter, at the start, was in Nicholson's reading a prize, and part of the prize was her dowry. She loved first, and wholly. He came to love her afterward, in the country that would kill her. Set those two facts side by side, and there is the engine of the tragedy, turning quietly under everything bright that is to come. They married on the 22nd of April, 1895. The terms of the marriage were written down, as such terms always were, and the numbers matter, because a great deal of nonsense has since been printed about them. Levi Leiter settled £140,000 on his daughter outright, and on top of it, an income of £6,000 a year. Curzon, characteristically, had hoped for £9,000. After Levi's death, the yearly figure climbed toward £20,000 and even £30,000. The American papers, meanwhile, told a wilder story, that Mary personally commanded $15 million in American securities, a claim Nicholson dismissed as disgraceful and probably libelous, because it was simply false. Beyond $5,000 of her own, Mary had no private fortune at all. The money was her father's, and it was handed through her to the man she had chosen. And that money did a specific and decisive thing. It took a spectacularly gifted man who could not otherwise afford his own ambitions, and it paid for them. Curzon meant to govern, to climb to the very summit of British public life. And the summit of British public life, in that age, quietly assumed that a man arrived there already rich. Curzon was not. Mary's dowry, which was Levi Leiter's dowry, closed the gap. It underwrote the receptions and the houses and the public style that a rising statesman was expected to keep and could not keep on £1,500 a year. The coronet, waiting at the end of the climb, was, in the plainest sense, a thing her family had bought and paid for, and the settlement papers were the receipt. What the price never listed was how much of the buyer would be spent along with the money. What she got, at first, was England, and England was cold to her. She had married one of its coming men, but she was still the Chicago dry goods heiress to the women who ruled the London drawing rooms, and they let her know it. She felt it, and she wrote it down, in letters that are the richest record any of these women left of the inside of the bargain. England, she confessed, could never, never take the place of home to her. As yet, she wrote, she was not attached to her new country. She had a gift for the exact, wounded phrase. Her path, she said, was strewn with roses, and the only thorns were the unforgiving women. She saw the whole machinery of that society clearly and named it, the little people praying to be noticed by the great, and the great seldom lowering their eyelids to look at the small. There was one man she had always looked up to without reservation, and that was her father. As a girl, she had written to Levi that she was afraid the man would never come along whom she could look up to and love as she did him. She called him Pappy, and in time, so did Curzon. Nicholson's quiet reading is that Curzon became for Mary exactly what Levi had been, the man to whom she gave, holding nothing back, all her love and admiration. She had found her match, or she had built him, and she had a fortune to give him, and a country that did not want her, and a husband whose love was still, in 1895, a thing she was waiting to earn. She would earn it in the one place grand enough to be worth the price. She would earn it in India. Chapter 5. 1,000 Peacock Eyes at Delhi. For one night in the marble hall of a Mughal palace, an American girl stood where emperors had sat, sheathed in cloth of gold, sewn with the eyes of peacocks. How she came to be standing there begins with what the money had bought. It had bought the viceroyalty of India, and the viceroyalty was a post nobody had been able to accept honourably without a private fortune of his own to sustain its enormous public style. Curzon, on his own, had none. He had Mary's. That is the plain, unglamorous root of the most glamorous night of her life. The Chicago dowry put a poor man on the grandest throne the British Empire had to give, and it put his American wife beside him. Mary Leiter became Vicereine of India in January of 1899 and held the place until November of 1905, and the scale of it is difficult to hold in the mind. At Calcutta, the viceregal household was served by some 600 servants. At the summer capital of Simla, up in the cool of the hills, 400 more. She was, for those years, the first lady of an empire of hundreds of millions, the wife of the man who ruled them, and every door on the subcontinent opened at her name. The Chicago girl the London women would not receive was now the most exalted woman in the British Empire east of Queen Victoria herself. It had cost her father's fortune to put her there. It would cost her far more than that to stay. The apex of it came at the very start of 1903, at Delhi, at the great Durbar that Curzon staged, in very large part himself, to mark the accession of Edward VII as Emperor of India. Curzon had a genius for pageantry and a perfectionist's mania for its smallest detail, and he poured both into a spectacle built to overwhelm. There were reviews and processions, and ruling princes brought in from across India in full regalia, some 50 of them. And there was, at the centre of the whole design, one evening that everything else existed to frame, the state ball, held in the marble heart of Shah Jahan's old Mughal palace, in the pavilion the emperors had once kept as their private hall of audience. The Durbar was a sprawl of engineered wonder, days of reviews and state entries and audiences staged to overwhelm, a temporary capital thrown up on the plain outside Delhi to hold the whole ruling apparatus of India at once. The princes arrived with their retinues and their own fortunes in jewels, and Curzon choreographed every yard of it. And Mary, who is so easily remembered only as the beautiful woman in the golden dress, did more inside that world than wear it. Within a month of reaching India, she had taken up the Countess of Dufferin Fund, which carried trained medical care to Indian women who would never see a male doctor. At the end of 1900, she founded and opened the Lady Curzon Hospital at Bangalore. After Queen Victoria died, she raised some £50,000 from the Indian nobility for a memorial scholarship. She lent her hand even to the protection of the great one-horned rhinoceros in the swamps of Assam, an early push toward what would in time become a national park. The empire was consuming her, but she was not idle inside it, and the good she did there was real, and it outlasted her too. The hall itself is a jewel. It is open marble, inlaid and cool, the place from which the fabled peacock throne had once ruled, the throne itself long gone. Curzon, who thought about everything, would not light it with the harsh new electric glare that was then the fashion for showing off. He had the bulbs hidden through the hall and shaded, so that the light they threw was, exactly as he wanted it, as soft as candlelight. Nearly 4,000 guests filled the space, the princes in their jewels, the officers in scarlet, the diplomats, the wives. And into that low gold light, on the arm of her husband, walked Mary. She wore the dress that history has refused to forget, and it deserves to be told slowly, because it was the empire itself worked into cloth. The design came from the House of Worth in Paris, from Jean-Philippe Worth, a gown of true cloth of gold. Across it ran a pattern of peacock feathers, worked in gold and silver by the raised metal embroidery the Indian workshops call zardozi, and the work was done in Delhi by the workshop of a master named Kishan Chand. Every feather ended in an eye, and each of those eyes was filled with the iridescent wing case of a beetle, a small, hard disc of natural green that caught the low light and threw it back with a shimmer beyond any emerald. 1,000 of them, give or take. 1,000 green eyes, unblinking, alive in that soft gold light with every breath she took. It was a heavy thing to carry. Between the gold thread and the metal and the beetle wing, the gown weighed more than 10 pounds, a thing to be borne as much as worn, and she bore it the length of that marble hall with the walk they had all once tried to describe, floating, undulating, the walk that had caught Curzon across a ballroom 13 years before. As she moved up the hall, with Curzon beside her in white satin knee breeches, there was a stir in the crowd. People who were there that night, people who had seen a great deal of grandeur in their lives, reached afterward for language and found it failing them. "You cannot conceive what a dream she looked," one of them wrote. "Such beauty," wrote another, "is not given to one woman in a million." 4,000 of the most powerful people in the East, and the room went quiet to watch an American walk across it, dressed as the vanished throne of the Mughals, paid for with Chicago money, made by Indian hands to a French design, standing where emperors had sat. If ever one image held the whole strange machine of these marriages in a single frame, it was that one, in that light, on that night. There was something the closest watchers noticed, even then, in the middle of her triumph. She had made herself, wholly, into an extension of her husband. Contemporaries, among them Consuelo Vanderbilt, who knew a great deal about being a decoration, marveled that Mary let her own personality be so completely eclipsed by Curzon's, to a degree beyond what anyone would have thought possible in an American girl of her intelligence and her spirit. She had wanted him, had waited 3 years for him, and now she poured herself into his ambition until very little of her showed that was not his. On the great nights, it looked like glory. On the quiet nights, it looked like something else. There were quiet nights that she loved. On the lake at Udaipur, out on the water in the moonlight, she watched the sky fill with drifting light and wrote of it afterward with a simplicity she seldom allowed herself. Hundreds of fire balloons floated about in the still moonlight, she wrote, and we sat in speechless delight. Those were the moments the empire gave her that belonged only to her and to Curzon, and to no one with the power to snub. In the middle of the largest public performance of her life, the record keeps handing back these small private lamps of happiness. She had bought her way, with her father's money, into a world that had shut its door on Chicago, and for a few years it was hers. The dress survives. It is in England now, and it has not aged kindly. The gold has tarnished. The bright dyes have gone dull, and when conservators examined it not long ago, they found it more fragile than anyone had realized, too weak now even to stand upright, so that it must be laid flat, a splendor lying down. The garment now outlived the woman who wore it by more than 100 years, and it faded exactly as she faded, the dazzling surface holding on long after the life beneath it had gone. Because the empire that gave Mary Leiter that one incandescent hour on the marble was, at that very moment, already beginning to kill her. The heat, the grinding ceremony that could never be refused, the thin air of the hills, and above all the children she kept trying to bear. All of it was wearing her body down while she smiled through the pageant. The stage her fortune had bought was the thing consuming her, and the place where it would very nearly finish the work lay far from India, back in England, on the cold coast of Kent, in a castle with a broken drain. Chapter 6. The Drains Beneath the Dying Room. The castle on the Kent coast that was meant to honour her was rotting from underneath, and the sewer beneath her bedroom window would help to kill her. The castle was Walmer, an ancient fortress that came by long tradition with a great office Curzon had been given, and it was in poor repair. Its drains, in particular, were clogged and lethal conduits, in the flat words of one account, and one old drain ran directly beneath the window of the room where Mary slept. A death trap, that account called it. No one understood that yet. She had been worn thin long before Kent. 6 years of India had cost her far more than the household ledgers ever showed. The heat of the plains, the ceremony that could not be put off, the altitude at Simla, the migraines that came and would not lift, and, above all of it, one pregnancy after another. She gave Curzon 3 daughters. She never gave him the son he wanted for his line, and she kept trying, and each attempt took something out of a body that had less and less to give. In the summer of 1904, the blows fell together. On the 9th of June, her father died, Levi Leiter, Pappy, the first man she had ever looked up to, gone in Chicago while she lay an ocean away. Close behind that grief came a miscarriage. And then, in the night, at Walmer, her body was seized by peritonitis and by phlebitis, a savage infection and a clotting of the blood, and she came very near to dying in that poisoned room. What had caused it, Nicholson concluded, was probably 2 things twisted together: the effects of the miscarriage and infection from the effluent of that old drain immediately beneath her bedroom window. The engineers, he wrote plainly, had bungled their job. The castle raised to dignify a vice-reign had poisoned her through the wall. For weeks the public bulletins went out, the language stiff and terrible. Her condition is exceedingly grave, while England read them over its breakfast, and Curzon sat by the bed. There was an omen, or what she took for one. In the worst of that autumn, she told Curzon that a little robin had flown in at the window, and that a robin indoors was, to her mind, the sign of a coming death. She survived the night. The omen, if it was one, simply waited its turn. He did a strange and moving thing in that vigil. He kept a pad of paper beside her, and as she drifted and surfaced and whispered, He wrote down in pencil every word she said. And what she said, believing she was dying, spoke of completion rather than fear. "Oh, how happy we have been," she told him. "You have been my only love. I die happy and without alarm." She died happy, she said, and the whole record of her life bends toward believing her. Read those words again and hold beside them the man they were spoken to, the man who, by his biographer's careful reckoning, had not loved her when he married her. She had waited 3 years for him, given him a fortune and a country and her whole eclipsed self. And here, at what they both took for the end, she was telling him she died happy, because by now he did love her, fully, the way she had always loved him. The love had ripened. It had needed India to ripen it, and it had very nearly needed her death to finish the work. Under the tenderness ran a small, sharp terror, and she whispered that too, and he wrote it down. "Don't put me in the ground. I have a horror of being put in the ground. Put me in the vault. Remember that. It will matter at the end." And then she did not die. Against every bulletin and every expectation, she rallied. She came back from the edge, and England breathed out. And for a while, it looked as though she had been given back to him. She had come back, but the ground beneath her had shifted for good. That night at Walmer was the wound she never truly healed. She had spent the reserve a body keeps for emergencies, and there was no refilling it. She lived on 2 more years, quieter and frailer, through the last bitter chapter of India. For even now, Curzon was locked in the ruinous quarrel with Lord Kitchener over the army that would break his viceroyalty and send him home resigned. She lived, and she loved him, and she knew the machine was still running. In the summer of 1906, she was at Carlton House Terrace in London. On the 7th of July, 11 days before the end, she left a note on his pillow, in her own hand, half tender and half apology, forgiving him in advance for whatever her failing body was about to make her. "When I am naughty," she wrote, "you will know it isn't your kinky but all these devilish ills. There is plenty of hope and light ahead," she went on, still at the very edge, reaching after the light. "But pray that I may yet bring him the sun in all its glory." And she signed it as she always signed to him. Love. 11 days later, on the 18th of July, 1906, a little before 6 in the evening, her heart failed. She was 36 years old. Curzon's arm was around her at the last. And then he did the thing that tells the whole of what she had finally become to him. He had the room locked. No one went back into it. Not a servant, not a doctor, not a member of the family, until the next day, when she had been laid in her coffin with his photograph placed in her hand and a single flower on her breast. Only then did he let them in. The man who had married her, by his biographer's reading, for a prize and a dowry, could not bear to let anyone else share the air of the room where she had died. She had asked to be buried at Kedleston, the Curzon seat in Derbyshire, the great house that was his by blood, and that her father's fortune had helped him hold. And she was buried there in the vault she had begged for, spared the cold ground whose very thought had filled her with horror. There, Curzon built her a chapel, and in it he laid a memorial of white marble, twin figures carved by Bertram McKennell, Mary in the full bloom of her young beauty, and, added years afterward, Curzon himself in his vice-regal robes, the two of them lying side by side, her hand clasped in his, forever, behind an iron grille he designed with his own hand and spent 5 years perfecting. He wrote the words cut into the stone. "Perfect in love and loveliness," they read, and then the line that says the whole thing in a breath from illness all but unto death, restored, only to die. The grief did not stay inside the family. More than 1,100 letters of condolence reached Curzon, and he answered most of them in his own hand. The American writer Henry Adams, who had loved her too in his distant way, wrote that he could not talk of her, that some visions are too radiant for words, and that when they fade, they leave life colourless. And there was one more turn the marble could not have foreseen. Mary's daughter Cynthia, who married the politician Oswald Mosley, would die in 1933, at almost the very age her mother had died, as though an early grave ran in the female line, while the effigy at Kedleston kept its serene young face above a family the years went on wounding. Kedleston still stands. It is a great house open to visitors now, and the marble Mary lies there yet. Curzon left a card in the vault beneath the chapel, reserving the central place, marked for the second Lady Curzon, and it is true that he married again, another American, years later, a woman who by every account understood that she had never taken Mary's place in his heart, and never would. But the centre of that tomb was always Mary's. She had waited 3 years to be loved. She got, in the end, the whole of a difficult man's heart, and a marble bed beside him, and an empire's worth of admiration, and she paid for every ounce of it with her body, dead at 36 in a locked room with his picture in her hand. That is the terrible arithmetic of Mary Leiter. She paid with her body, and at the very last she was given the love she had waited and suffered for. The next woman in this story struck a different bargain and paid a different price. She kept her health, she kept her life, and lived to be old. What she lost was something she valued nearly as much as either, her dignity, handed over piece by piece to a beautiful man who took her father's fortune and spent it on himself and on his mistresses, down to the very last dollar. Chapter 7. Cash for a coronet on Fifth Avenue. The plain daughter of a robber baron married the handsomest man in Paris, and a society writer called it, plainly, a simple case of cash for a coronet. The writer was a man named Will Clemens. He was not reaching for a cruel phrase. In the year 1895, that was simply the nature of the transaction, and everyone standing in the room understood it. Her name was Anna Gould, and the sentence would follow her for the rest of her life. It cut so deep because of the man her father was. J. Gould was the pattern from which the American robber baron was cut. He made himself in the railroad wars of the 1860s and 70s, in the long fight for the Erie and the fight for the Union Pacific, in the panic of Black Friday in 1869 that he had helped to engineer. By 1881, he held something like 15,800 miles of track, roughly 15% of every rail line in the country, and the telegraph wires of Western Union on top of that. He was hated with a thoroughness few men ever managed to earn. The methods that built the fortune were the ground the coronet stood on. In the war for the Erie Railroad, he fought Cornelius Vanderbilt himself, printing fresh shares faster than Vanderbilt could buy them, and leaning on Boss Tweed and the machine of Tammany Hall to keep the courts friendly. And Vanderbilt is said to have lost $7 million on the watered paper. On Black Friday, in September of 1869, Gould and his partner James Fisk tried to corner the whole of the nation's gold, and when the scheme broke, it ruined thousands, rich and poor together, in a single afternoon. This was the money that would one day dress his youngest daughter for her wedding. When he died in December of 1892, the appraisers put his estate at $85 million, though the true figure was likely nearer $125 million, and it was divided among his 6 children. Anna was the youngest daughter. She was 17 years old, and she was an orphan. Her own share is documented at roughly $15 million, held in trust, throwing off close to $500,000 a year in income. A fortune one source reckons at something near $500 million in the money of the present day. She had money the way the sea has water. What the Gould name could not buy her was the one thing she may have wanted most, which was a place at home. New money, however vast, however many thousand miles of track it owned, was turned away at the doors of old New York, and a foreign title was the single article American dollars could not purchase on American soil. So the Gould daughters would go abroad to buy the rank their own country would not sell them. For Anna, the calculation was colder still, because the world she was born into priced its women by two things at once: the size of the dowry and the beauty of the face. And it had already decided that she carried only the first. The cruelty arrives early, and it arrives fast. Anna Gould was considered plain, and the record keeps the words, and the words are ugly. One contemporary called her short, petulant, and not especially pretty. Another crushed the whole of society's judgment into a single image that trailed her like a shadow, that she was a little monkey dressed as a princess. She was 17 years old, orphaned, and among the richest young women alive, and the people in her own drawing rooms called her a monkey. Into that wound walked Paul Ernest Boniface de Castellane, called Boni, and he was, by every account that survives, beautiful. He had a porcelain complexion, lavender blue eyes, and waves of blonde hair, and he carried himself like a man who had never once in his life been told no. He was a French count of an ancient and cash-starved house, a golden dandy of the Paris salons, whose taste was exquisite and whose income had run dry, and he is often called the first Frenchman to marry an American heiress. The contrast between the two of them was itself the scandal. The plain heiress and the beautiful count made a picture that the newspapers of two continents could read at a single glance, and what they read in it was money changing hands. They were married on the 4th of March in 1895 in the Fifth Avenue mansion of Anna's brother George. It was a spectacle, and it was built to be one. The wedding cost $160,000. Anna's veil hung from a coronet of emeralds and diamonds that had cost $40,000 on its own. The bridegroom's gift to his bride was a brooch set with 250 large diamonds and 2 immense emeralds, and each of those 2 emeralds had cost $14,000. Every last figure reached the papers because the figures were the story. Her trousseau filled 12 trunks, and inside them lay some $3,000 of handmade lingerie, and the whole apparatus of the day, the gifts, the flowers, the 100 small ceremonies, was arranged so that a sale might look like a fairy tale. It did not quite work. The newspapers of Paris and New York alike treated the union less as a romance than as a purchase concluded at the altar, with the goods on public display. A coronet is a small crown. This one was also a receipt. $40,000, worn on the head, itemized in the morning editions, the proof of purchase for a title that Anna Gould had bought with her dead father's railroad money, and that the world would never afterward let her wear in peace. The contemporary press was merciless, and it was merciless to both of them. Natalie Clifford Barney, the American writer who kept a salon in Paris, looked at the newly married pair and recorded a verdict of pure ice, that Anna was the most unwashed and dirty-looking creature I ever laid eyes on, and Boni the most insipid. Quel ménage, she finished, which is to say, what a household. The bride was rich enough to buy a French palace and could not buy herself a kind sentence. And through the whole of it, Anna herself said, for the record, almost nothing. This is the strange, aching fact at the centre of her story, and it belongs here, at the wedding, before the spending begins. The most talked about American woman in Paris left no memoir and scarcely a single line in her own voice. Every cruel word that survives about this marriage was spoken about her. Almost none of it was ever spoken by her. She did not have long to wait to learn what she had bought. On the 2nd of July in 1896, for Anna's 21st birthday, Boni staged a lakeside fête on the water of the Bois de Boulogne, dressed in the whole manner of the court of Louis XIV, and it cost, by the sober reckoning, something near $150,000. As the legend has it, there were hundreds of footmen in powdered wigs and white swans gliding on the lake, and the numbers have swelled comfortably in the retelling ever since. The exact count of footmen hardly matters. The anchor beneath the legend is hard and plain, that a single party on a single summer evening cost near $150,000 of Jay Gould's railroad money, spent to make a beautiful young Frenchman the most talked-about host in Europe, on the 21st birthday of the wife who paid for the swans. The coronet had been the first receipt. Boni de Castellane already had the next one in his mind, and it would be enormous. It would be built of pink marble, and it would be built with her money, and it would tell a lie about the very stone it was made of. Chapter 8. A pink palace built to spend her. He built her a pink marble palace and painted the marble where the real stone disappointed him, a beautiful lie raised on 10 million of her dollars. It was called the Palais Rose, and it rose on the Avenue du Bois, and it was, in the plainest terms, a copy. Boni had chosen as his model the Grand Trianon at Versailles, the pink garden palace of Louis XIV, and he did not copy it modestly. He had his version cut from pink marble, drawn out of the very quarries the old king had used, and then he had it raised to double the height of the original, some 65,000 square feet of it, designed by the architect Ernest Sanson. The land alone cost 3,600,000 francs. The building itself cost around $3 million, a sum near 100 million in the money of today. Inside he hung Gobelin's tapestries and the canvases of old masters, and among them he set a clock that Louis XIV had once given to the Pope. One detail gives the whole marriage away. The facade was refaced twice before Boni was satisfied with it, and where the real marble displeased him, where the true pink stone was not quite pink enough or quite perfect enough, he had it painted over, a skin of counterfeit marble brushed by hand across the surface of genuine marble. A palace of real stone, wearing a coat of painted stone, because the real thing had failed to be beautiful enough for him. That was the whole arrangement in a single wall, a real fortune, a real title, and a love painted onto a surface that had none underneath, and the paint was the truest thing in the building. The numbers are documented, and they are staggering. In the first 5 years of the marriage, Boni spent more than $7,700,000, a sum near 251 million in today's terms. By the year 1900, roughly $8 million of Anna's capital was simply gone. There was the Walhalla, a yacht that cost $200,000. There was the run for the Chamber of Deputies in 1898. $300,000 poured into a seat he won twice and was thrown out of twice, on both occasions for buying the votes. Over the 11 years of the marriage, he consumed something close to $10 million of her father's money. The yacht alone carried a crew of nearly 100 men. There were country houses besides the Pink Palace, the Château du Marais, and the Château de Grignon, bought the way a careless man buys a coat and forgets it in a cloakroom. The spending had a quality that unsettled even those who profited from it, a hunger that no fortune could fill and no pleasure could quiet, and it fell, every franc of it, on money a dead robber baron had clawed out of the American railroads for his children to keep. The bleeding was stopped only by her own family. In 1900, with 8 million already burned, Anna's brother George stepped in and placed her under a trusteeship, capping her allowance at around $300,000 a year. A grown woman, one of the richest in the world, was put on an allowance because the man she had married could not be trusted anywhere near her own capital. The stone was only part of it. Boni kept mistresses, and by the record, much of Anna's fortune went, in the plain language of the divorce case, to lavish expensive gifts upon his various mistresses, women the court papers hid behind nothing but a single initial each, and of the marriage bed itself, of the wife who had bought him and borne his sons, Boni is remembered for one phrase above all others. He called it the expiatory chapel, the place, that is, where a man does his penance. He said that of the woman whose money he was spending by the million. The one living creature the record shows him treating with tenderness was his aged bulldog, Boul, which he praised for its tender character and its expressive, loving eyes. He could find that softness for a dog. Time would later call the whole 11 years an 11-year phantasmagoria of pink marble palaces and $150,000 parties. And Anna, who paid for the phantasmagoria from the first franc to the last, is barely quoted anywhere inside it. She was silent, and then she moved. On the 20th of January in 1906, she filed. On the 14th of November of that same year, the Tribunal of the Seine granted the divorce on grounds of physical and moral injuries, which included his striking her and his open infidelities. She forbade Boni any further contact with their sons. Then she did the thing that scandalized society all over again, on entirely fresh terms. In 1908, she married a second time, and the man she chose was Hélie de Talleyrand-Périgord, the Prince de Sagon, who happened to be Boni's own first cousin and his lifelong social rival. She had married straight back into the very family, one branch along, to the relative who could least abide him. Whatever else it was a choice, and it was hers, and it held. That marriage stayed steady until Hélie's death in 1937, in a way the first had never once managed. Boni, for his part, came apart entirely. Ruined, cut off from the fortune that had made him what he was, he spent the better part of 2 decades chasing a church annulment of the marriage, a farce that dragged on until 1924 and 1925 and ended with the marriage declared valid after all. A spectacle time compared to the case of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. He set himself up as a dealer in antiques. He wrote his memoirs, 2 volumes of them, and the title of the second is the finest joke the whole story tells, because the man who had set fire to $10 million of another person's fortune sat down and called his little book The Art of Being Poor. He died in 1932, owing money to his florist, to his shirt maker, and to his tailor. A shadow lay over the second marriage too, though the papers were gentler about it. A son of that later union, a boy named Howard, died by his own hand at about 20 years of age in 1929, so that even Anna's steadier and happier act carried its private grief folded inside it. She had escaped the count who spent her. She had not escaped sorrow. No one in this whole account ever quite does. As for the Pink Palace, the monument he had raised to himself on her money, it did not survive the century. The Nazis occupied it during the war. In 1969 it was pulled down, and an apartment block went up in its place, and nothing of the $10 million was left standing on the ground. Here the pattern of these lives bends. This is the one great house in the whole account that did not survive to the present day. The Pink Palace outlived Anna herself by only 8 years, pulled down 8 years after she died, and then it was gone for good. What survived instead stood on the far side of the ocean, and it was a house she chose. Lyndhurst, the Gould estate above the Hudson, she left in her will to the National Trust for Historic Preservation as a memorial to her parents, and after a contest, the trust received the house and 67 acres. It stands today as a museum. The pink monument to her humiliation is rubble beneath an apartment block in Paris. The house she gave away in her mother and father's name is the thing that endured. Anna Gould died in Paris late in 1961, 86 years old. She had outlived the beautiful count who mocked her, dead almost 30 years by then. She had outlived the cousin she married in his place. She had outlived the men who priced her and the men who spent her. And she had outlived the palace built to glorify a husband who never loved her. Her fortune had been plundered, close to $10 million of it, poured into pink marble and mistresses and painted lies. In the end, though, it was only money, and she outlasted every man who took it from her. The next woman in this story brought far less money to her bargain, and she lost far more, because she paid her dukedom in something dearer than any fortune, her charm, her nursing, and in the end, her children. Chapter 9. The banjo that opened the door. Before any of them, there was a Cuban-American girl with a banjo who nursed a sick young lord back to health and married him, and taught a whole generation how it was done. She was born around 1853, though the record is honest enough to admit that it does not entirely know. A few sources say 1858. Most likely she came into the world in New York City. Her full name was a small aria in itself, Maria Francisca de la Consolación Yznaga, and the world would shorten it, inevitably, to Consuelo. Her father, Antonio Yznaga del Valle, was a Cuban-American sugar planter and merchant, and the money that dressed his daughter came up out of the ground. Cane fields in Cuba and in Louisiana, and the labor of the enslaved people who worked them. Her mother, Ellen Clement, was the daughter of a Mississippi steamboat captain and brought a Louisiana plantation of her own, called Ravenswood, into the marriage. The family name still marks a tower on the Cuban plain, a tall stone watchtower raised so that an overseer could look down on the people he owned. That is where the charm was funded from, and it should be said plainly before the drawing rooms fill with music. The legend, though, gets one thing wrong about her, and it is the thing that matters most. The Yznagas were genuinely rich. They were also, measured against the fortunes that would soon come chasing after them across the Atlantic, quite modest. When her brother Fernando died in 1901, his whole estate came to about $2 million. Set that beside the Vanderbilts and the Goulds and the Astors, whose money was counted in the tens and the hundreds of millions, and the real nature of Consuelo Yznaga comes clear. Her fortune was social. Beauty, wit, warmth, and performance were her working capital, and she spent them more skillfully than any heiress of her generation. She traded in charm, the others traded in cash, and the charm was a genuine spectacle. The National Portrait Gallery, an institution not much given to gossip, records her fondness for playing the banjo. Her contemporaries went a good deal further. She reportedly smoked cigars. She reportedly played that banjo in cold English drawing rooms, where such an instrument had never once been heard, and sang songs a shade too risque for the company, and told stories that made the fast young men around the Prince of Wales laugh out loud, and made the stiff old dowagers stiffen further. She was warm where her world was cold, loud where it was quiet, and alive in a way that money alone could never manufacture. People wanted to be near her. That, in the end, was the whole of her power. The society she was conquering was not, on its surface, built for a girl like her. It was old and closed and suspicious of noise. But it had a soft centre, and the soft centre was the circle around the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, whose Marlborough house set prized amusement above almost everything and were bored, chronically, magnificently bored. Into that boredom walked a Cuban-American girl who could play and sing and smoke and turn a dull evening into one worth remembering. She held that circle by performance alone, and an entertainer who can keep the future king amused holds something more durable than a bank balance, for a while at least. Her closest friend in the world was Alva Vanderbilt, another outsider with sharp elbows and a longer plan. And when Alva had a daughter, she named the child Consuelo after her friend, and asked Consuelo Yznaga to stand as godmother. The two women must be kept straight, because history almost never bothers to. The godmother is this one, the banjo player, the buccaneer born around 1853. The goddaughter is the other Consuelo Vanderbilt, who a generation later would weep behind a locked door on her wedding morning and be married to a Duke of Marlborough she did not love. Two women, one shared name, bound by real affection at the very start of the whole story. One chose the trade, the other was forced into it, and it was the first one who showed that the trade could be made at all. The bond between the two families ran by blood as well as by affection. Consuelo Yznaga's brother Fernando married Alva's sister, so that the Yznagas and the Vanderbilts were tied together twice over, by a christening and by a wedding both. And the Yznagas were exactly the sort of family old New York looked straight past. Cuban on the father's side, a steamboat captain's line on the mother's, foreign and loud, and not quite respectable to the people who counted such things. And the great Mrs. Astor herself is said to have snubbed Consuelo over precisely those origins. What old New York would not give her, the future King of England would. She simply went to where the door would open. The bargain that made her famous began with an act of kindness. In the autumn of 1875, a young English aristocrat travelling through America fell ill. His name was George Victor Drogo Montague, and he carried the courtesy title Viscount Mandeville, which meant he was the heir to the Duke of Manchester and to one of the older coronets in England. Consuelo and her mother took him in and nursed him back to health. Somewhere in that sick room, over broth and cool cloths and long convalescent afternoons, the bargain of the coming age was quietly struck. She fell for the future Duke. He fell for the money. Both of them believed they had made a fine deal. They married on the 22nd of May, 1876, at Grace Church on Broadway in Manhattan. Some 1,200 guests were invited into the pews, which by itself made it one of the largest society weddings the city had yet seen. Outside in the street, the crowd did the rest. So many carriages converged on the church, and so many drivers fought for the same few yards of curb, that the whole thing caused a traffic jam along Broadway, the busiest street in America, brought to a dead stop by a Cuban-American girl marrying an English lord. It was the first of the great transatlantic weddings of its kind. It was the template every Leiter bride in this story would follow without quite knowing it. The American fortune, the English title, the crowd, the flowers, the sense of a deal being sealed in public to the sound of an organ. Everyone who read about it over breakfast the next morning wanted one of their own. What she actually brought him is disputed to this day, and the honest number is the smaller one. £200,000, about $1 million in the money of 1876, is the figure that fits the woman, large enough to matter, and modest enough to leave a hungry dukedom still hungry. A far grander figure, $6 million, has been copied from source to source down the years, and it is almost certainly an error, the kind of extra zero the newspapers loved to add. The contemporary verdict on the match, though, needed no exact figures. He had married her for her fortune, and she had married him for his titles, and both sides considered the exchange entirely fair. She is the woman people reach for when they read Edith Wharton's novel about these very marriages, The Buccaneers, and meet the warm, dark-eyed character called Conchita Closson. Consuelo Yznaga has long been identified as the model. Wharton herself left nothing in writing to confirm it, So the claim rests where it should, in the space between very likely and formally proven. But the shape of it fits, the Latin warmth, the banjo, the charm, and above all, the fact that she went first. Wharton called these women buccaneers, and she meant it as a compliment. They were raiders in her telling, storming a citadel and carrying off exactly what they came for. Because Consuelo Yznaga did go first. Before May Goelet, before Mary Leiter, before Anna Gould, before the goddaughter who carried her name into St. Thomas's Church 19 years later, there was this one wedding on Broadway and this one crowd stopping the traffic to see it. She was the proof that it could be done. An American fortune could buy an English coronet, and she made the purchase look less like a transaction and more like a triumph, done with style and done with obvious joy. She opened the door, and a whole generation of ambitious American girls and their still more ambitious mothers walked through it behind her, following the light she had left burning. What none of them could see, and what she could not see either as the organ played and the crowd cheered outside, was where the door actually led. At the far end of the corridor she had just opened stood the man she had nursed back to life. He was already a drunk. He was already a gambler. He was already, even before the vows, half an outcast in his own society. And he was waiting, with a patience he showed in nothing else, to spend every last dollar and every last ounce of charm that Consuelo Yznaga had. Chapter 10. A Duke Drinks a Fortune to Death. The man she had nursed back to life kept a music hall singer on her money, drank his way through her settlement, and died a bankrupt at 39. That was the return on her kindness. That was the marriage. George Montague was a disaster before Consuelo ever married him, and everyone who mattered knew it. He was known as a drunk and a social outcast, while he was still only the heir. He was a heavy drinker, a compulsive gambler, and a serial adulterer, and he wore all three like a coat he had no intention of ever taking off. She had seen the softest version of him, sick and grateful in a borrowed bed. She married the other one. His most notorious affair was with a music hall singer named Bessie Bellwood, a woman of the London stage whom he kept openly in daylight, where his wife and everyone in his wife's world could see it plainly. A duchess in the making, humiliated in full public view, while her husband spent her dowry on a woman who sang for her supper. And still, Consuelo held the line the only way left to her, with dignity and a dry tongue. She reportedly said of him, in the weariest sentence in this whole story, "He so often disappoints me that I generally make up my mind to go without him." Read it twice. It is the sound of a woman who has stopped hoping and simply learned to arrive alone. By 1882, the Duke's own father had seen enough of his heir. He effectively banished the couple to Tandragee Castle in County Armagh in Ireland to keep the young man out of trouble and out of sight. It was a handsome exile, and a real one. Some 14 years at the far green edge of the family's holdings, the ancestral Irish seat turned into a place to store an embarrassment. The Manchesters had grander houses than that. Chief among them was Kimbolton Castle in Huntingdonshire, home to the family since 1615, old enough that Catherine of Aragon had died within its walls. But grandeur was exactly the problem, because grandeur cost money, and the money was going. And here the personal ruin met a larger one that no bride could have fixed. The great agricultural depression of the 1880s, cheap American grain crossing the same ocean the American brides were crossing, was gutting the rents that funded every landed family in Britain. Across that single decade, the Manchester income fell from about £90,000 a year to about £25,000. Consuelo's cash was poured into a structure that was already subsiding for reasons her dowry could not touch, and it vanished into the cracks. The dowry drained into ground that was already sinking, and no settlement drawn by any lawyer could have shored it up. He became 8th Duke of Manchester in 1890. In that same year, he was declared bankrupt, with liabilities of around £600,000. 2 years a duke was all he managed. He died on the 18th of August, 1892, at Tandragee, aged 39, of cirrhosis of the liver. Drink killed him, essentially on schedule. By then, he and Consuelo had lived apart for years. The man she had nursed back to life in 1875 had drunk himself back out of it inside 17 years and taken her fortune with him on the way down. This is the part of the story that gets left out, because it is the part that hurts. Consuelo Yznaga had 3 children. 2 of them were twin girls, and she buried them both before anyone buried her. Lady Jacqueline, called May, born in November of 1879, died in March of 1895 at the age of 15 of tuberculosis, the consumption that hollowed out so many families of that century. Her twin sister, Lady Alice, called Nell, lasted a little longer and died just as surely in January of 1900 at the age of 20 of the same disease. Picture the years between. A mother chasing alpine cures from London to St. Moritz, moving a delicate daughter from spa to sanatorium, up into the clean, cold mountain air that was supposed to save consumptives and so rarely did. Watching first one girl and then, 5 years later, the other cough her way out of the world. She had married a coronet, and the coronet had cost her both her daughters. No mother's fortune, large or small, buys a child back from that disease. For 14 years the couple had been kept out at Tandragee, in the soft green quiet of County Armagh, and the exile did nothing to slow the spending. It only moved it beyond the sight of London. When at last the old Duke died and the title fell to George, it fell with the bankruptcy already fastened to it, so that Consuelo became a duchess and a pauper in the same season. She took a house in Grosvenor Square all the same, in the very heart of Mayfair, and she filled it with the people who mattered, because the performance was the only asset the marriage had left her, and she would keep it running until the day it closed. Widowed at about 39 and very nearly broke, her settlement long since drunk away, Consuelo survived on allowances from her surviving child and, after 1901, on the $2 million her brother Fernando left behind when he died. And still, she performed. Performance was the only trade she had ever really known. In 1903, she went to Cartier in Paris and commissioned a tiara. She was a widow, short of money, and she supplied some 1,400 of her own diamonds for it, set into a design of flaming hearts and scrolls, and the scrolls were curled into the shape of the letter C for Consuelo. It was vanity, and it was defiance, and it was a flat refusal to slip quietly down from the summit while the summit was being sold out from under her. Those diamonds would outlast the money by a full century. They sit behind glass in a London museum to this day, surrendered to the government against a tax bill in 2007, the last of the Manchester treasure paying a debt long after every hand that spent the fortune had gone still. And here is the image to hold. At the very top of the world she had married into, entertaining the Prince of Wales himself, and later the King, and on at least one occasion the Tsar of Russia. The Duchess of Manchester had grown so poor that her friends reportedly carried in the very dishes of food so that she could feed a future king at her own table in a house she could barely afford to keep lit. The title was total. The money was gone. She kept the performance running to the very end, and almost no one at those glittering dinners knew. She died on the 20th of November, 1909, at her house in Grosvenor Square, in Mayfair, aged about 56. Her estate came to a little under $2.5 million. She left a bracelet of rubies and diamonds to Queen Alexandra. She had reached the very summit of the oldest society on earth, kings and an emperor at her table, and she had paid for the climb with her fortune, her husband, and both of her girls. Society, when it spoke of her at all, called it bad luck. A weak husband, a cruel disease, a run of tragedy no one could have foreseen. Consuelo Yznaga gave everything she had, her money, her charm, her nursing, and her good name, and the dukedom consumed all of it and filed the loss under misfortune. But her son was already growing up inside that same house, learning that same appetite. He would marry another American girl, with another American fortune behind her, and he would do to that girl very nearly what his father had done to his mother. And when he did, the pattern would finally show its face and prove that it was never luck at all. It was the machine. Chapter 11. The son marries the next American fortune. 24 years after the first American bride walked into the Manchester dukedom, her son married a second one, quietly, almost in secret, and everyone who knew both families was appalled. The bride was Helena Zimmerman, an only child from Cincinnati. The groom was William Angus Drogo Montague, the 9th Duke of Manchester, known to the few who liked him as Kim, and he was the son of Consuelo Yznaga, the 8th Duchess of Manchester, the banjo-playing Cuban-American girl who a generation before had opened the door that every dollar princess after her walked through. The same coronet, the same house. A second American fortune, one bloodline later. And this time there was a man watching who understood exactly what he was looking at. The horror of the match lay in what the first fortune had already bought. Consuelo Yznaga had brought her charm and her settlement into the Manchester family in 1876, and the house had spent both. Her husband drank her money into the ground, kept a music hall singer in open view of London society, and died of drink at 39, barely a duke at all. She buried both of her young daughters before illness came for her too. Of the children she had brought into that marriage, only the son survived to inherit, and the son was Kim. So when he crossed the sea in search of a rich American girl to marry, he was continuing his family's history rather than breaking with it. He was doing to a stranger exactly what had been done to his mother, and his mother, still living, could see it as clearly as if it were happening in a mirror. Helena's father had built his money himself, without a name to inherit or a family to open the first door for him. Eugene Zimmerman came out of the American Civil War, a commander in the Union Navy at 19, and he spent the decades after it assembling the kind of fortune the older aristocracy of Europe found faintly alarming. He drilled for oil, he cut timber, and he bought his way into railroads. When John Rockefeller came for the oil men of the region, Zimmerman sold his holdings and took his payment in Standard Oil shares and a seat on the board, which was another way of saying he took a permanent share of the largest fortune of the age. He held one railroad presidency after another. On the sale of the Cincinnati, Hamilton and Dayton line to the banker John Pierpont Morgan alone, he cleared more than $1 million. By the end, he sat on an estate worth roughly $10 million, a sum that in the money of a later century would run into the hundreds of millions. He was new money of the hardest and most self-reliant kind, and he had exactly one child to leave it to. There was steel in the man from the very start. He had gone into the Union Navy as a boy and risen fast, said to have been the youngest officer of his rank in the whole service at 19, and he had seen real fighting on the western rivers, at the taking of Arkansas Post, and through the long, grinding campaign for Vicksburg. He had been handed nothing. He had taken it, out of oil fields and forests and the iron nerve of the railroad business, and a man who builds a fortune that way does not lightly hand it across a dinner table to a stranger with a title and a taste for other people's money. Everything he would do for his daughter afterward followed from that plain fact about her father. Helena Zimmerman was born in Cincinnati in 1878, and the first loss of her life arrived when she was 4 years old. Her mother died of peritonitis in 1882, and the little girl who was left was raised, as motherless heiresses of her class often were, at a distance from the country of her birth. She grew up largely in France. She learned to ride, to fence, and to swim, and she did all three well. By the summer of 1900, the American papers had noticed her the way they noticed any rich, unmarried girl at a fashionable resort, and a Cincinnati writer set her down at Narragansett as a handsome blonde and a belle, an expert swimmer seen on the beach daily. She was healthy, wealthy, well-travelled, and 21 years old. She was also precisely the sort of prize the Manchester dukedom had learned, a generation earlier, how to catch. She came from money that could buy anything money could buy, and she came from the wrong side of an invisible line that money alone could not cross. That was the whole engine of the age. New American fortunes, however vast, were held at arm's length by the old families of New York and the older families of Europe both. And a title was the one thing a fortune could purchase that the fortune itself could not manufacture. Helena had been raised abroad among people who had never quite let her in. A coronet would let her in for good. She met the 9th Duke that same year at a fancy dress ball at Dinard on the coast of France. He was 23, charming in the way his father had been charming, and already ruined. His mother's marriage had poured one American settlement into the Manchester estates and watched it vanish, and the son had inherited the debts along with the coronet. By some accounts, his affairs had already collapsed into formal bankruptcy in the very months before he proposed, though that particular date rests on thinner evidence than the rest of the story. What is beyond dispute is that the Duke of Manchester was effectively bankrupt on the day he married, that he knew it, and that Helena's father knew it too. The wedding was held on the 14th of November, 1900, at the Church of St. Marylebone in London, and it was so quiet that it read less like a celebration than like something being got out of the way. There was no crush of carriages, no traffic stopped along a great avenue, none of the spectacle that had marked the elder Duchess's own wedding at Grace Church in New York a quarter of a century before, when the carriages had jammed Broadway solid. Helena's father was not there. The groom's mother was not there. The bride of a duke and the son of a duchess were joined in front of a scattering of witnesses in a half-empty church, and the ceremony was over almost before the city noticed it had happened. The coronet that came with the marriage was, as it had been for every American bride before her, a kind of receipt, proof of a purchase already made. Helena would spend the rest of her life learning the price. In Cincinnati, where the papers had been waiting for a grand society wedding to write about, the silence of the thing was taken as an insult, and the coverage curdled into disappointment. In London and New York, the reaction ran deeper than disappointment. Both families were appalled for opposite reasons, and both were right. Consuelo Yznaga, the elder duchess, was appalled that her son had gone and done the very thing that had been done to her, dragging another American girl and another American fortune into a house that had already eaten one. Eugene Zimmerman was appalled at the man himself. He looked at the Duke of Manchester and saw someone nearly bankrupt and, worse than bankrupt, aimless, a titled young man with no trade, no discipline, and no visible intention of acquiring either. The mother feared the pattern, the father feared the person. Between them they had assembled a fairly complete picture of what the marriage was going to be. An early sign came within a month of the wedding. That December, the new Duke walked into a Broadway jeweler and bought 3 imitation pearl necklaces, priced at $695, to give as wedding gifts. Fake pearls, offered as tokens of a new marriage. He did not pay for them. The following year, the jeweler took him to court to recover the money. It is a small story, and it is the whole marriage in miniature. A love token that was counterfeit, bought on credit that was never honored, ending in a lawsuit. Helena had married a man who could not be trusted to pay for a strand of glass beads. Her father had noticed. And while the couple settled into the borrowed grandeur of a bankrupt dukedom, Eugene Zimmerman went quietly to his lawyers and began to build something that no title, no charm, and no ingenuity of the dukes would ever be able to open. Chapter 12. A father locks the money away. Eugene Zimmerman had watched one dukedom devour one American fortune, and he built a legal wall so it could not devour his daughters. He had not needed to guess at what was coming. It had already happened, once, in the same house, to the mother of the man Helena had married, and the wreckage of it was a matter of public record. Consuelo Yznaga's settlement had gone into the Manchester estates and disappeared, and she had died at the summit of society and very nearly penniless, her friends quietly sending in dishes of food so that a duchess could go on entertaining a king. Zimmerman read that story while it was still ending. He did not intend to finance its sequel. There was a bitter symmetry in it that he must have felt keenly. Consuelo Yznaga had come to the Manchester family with charm rather than cash, and no one had built a wall around what little she had, because in her day, the whole art was to let the money flow toward the house. Helena came with an American industrial fortune and a father who had spent his life watching men try to take things from him. The groom was cut from the same cloth as his father. The coronet was the same coronet. What had changed, and it changed everything, was the man standing behind the bride, and what that man had learned from watching. The Duke's debts did not wait long to announce themselves. They mounted the way water finds a low place, steadily and from every direction, and within a few years of the wedding, they had reached the point where someone with money would have to decide whether to let the house go under or to step in. In 1908, Eugene Zimmerman stepped in and paid the Duke's debts, but he did it in a way that told everyone, including the Duke, exactly how far his trust extended. Instead of handing cash to the Duke, he bought estates and property outright and settled them in trust for his grandson, the couple's son, the next heir, so that what his money purchased could never belong to the Duke and could never be sold out from under the family by him. 5 years earlier, he had already bought Kylemore Castle, a vast pile on a lake in Connemara in the west of Ireland, as a home for the couple to live in. Even his generosity came wrapped in a lock. He gave them a house to live in, and he kept the ownership of it where the Duke's hands could never reach. An American father went to such lengths because of the law he was working against. For centuries, English common law had held that a married woman's property became her husband's the moment she married, hers only for as long as he permitted. Britain had begun to dismantle that rule within Zimmerman's own lifetime through the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882. But the old assumptions lingered, and the whole quiet purpose of an English marriage to a cash-poor lord was that the American dollars would run, in the end, to the lord's house and the lord's creditors. This was the machinery every dollar Princess's father had to reckon with, and most of them reckoned with it by building trusts, ring-fencing the fortune so that the income could support the couple while the principal stayed beyond the husband's reach. Eugene Zimmerman took that ordinary instrument and drove it to its logical end. He built something closer to a vault. His will was the wall's final course of stone. When its terms became known, they were stark enough that the newspapers reported them as news. The entire fortune, some $10 million, was placed in trust. The Duke of Manchester received nothing at all. Helena received the income, a yearly sum reported at about $10,000. enough to live as a duchess should live, while the principal itself stayed in the hands of trustees who answered to the dead man's instructions and not to the living duke's wants. Eugene Zimmerman had found the one form of love that a man like the duke could not spend. He gave his daughter everything and gave her husband access to none of it. It was a strange inheritance to leave a child, a fortune she could feel the whole weight of and never quite lift. $10 million that existed entirely for her and yet stood always just beyond her own reaching hand, as much as her husband's. But the alternative was written plainly in the family album, in the fate of the woman in the room next door, the elder duchess who had died at the very summit of society with her friends carrying in the food. Against that ending, a gilded cage looked, to a careful father in Ohio, very much like mercy. A Cincinnati newspaper put the whole arrangement into a single sentence that needed no explaining. On the 4th of November, 1915, the Cincinnati Post reported it plainly. Not a cent of the Duchess of Manchester's Cincinnati-made money will go to help the Duke out of his $1 million in debts. $1 million owed, and not 1 cent of Zimmerman money moving to cover it. A father in Ohio had reached across an ocean, and, from a position the Duke could not argue with, or charm, or sue, sealed the vault. There is a way of telling this that makes Eugene Zimmerman sound cold, a controlling man reaching from beyond his own life to govern a grown daughter's affairs. The record does not support that telling. What he had done was the opposite of cold. He had watched the aristocracy his daughter married into take one American woman's fortune and spend it down to the plates on her table, and he had loved his own daughter enough to make certain the same thing could never be done to her. His distrust of the Duke was the single most protective act available to a man in his position, and it was aimed with great care at exactly the right target. He trusted his daughter completely. He trusted the man she had married with a single dollar, and events would bear him out in every particular. He had reason beyond the Duke's debts, too. This was his only child, motherless since she was 4, raised half a world away in the care of governesses and schools, married in a near-empty church he had not attended to a man he considered ruined and idle. Whatever else the money could not fix, it could at least guarantee that his daughter would never be poor, never be dependent on the goodwill of creditors, never find herself, as her mother-in-law had, hosting an emperor on borrowed food. A dead man cannot protect his child from an unhappy marriage. He can only make sure the marriage does not also leave her destitute. Zimmerman did the one thing that was still in his power to do, and he did it thoroughly. And here was the strange shape of what he had built. Helena Zimmerman was among the richest women in England, and the arrangement that kept her rich rested precisely on the certainty that, left within her husband's reach, her money would not survive him. Her fortune was mighty on paper and helpless in fact, protected only by being held where even she could not simply sign it away. The wall did what her father designed it to do. It kept the $10 million whole. What it could not do was reform the man on the other side of it, and a ruined man who cannot reach his wife's fortune, and who has already worn out every creditor and every acquaintance in London, will in the end reach for something no father's wall was ever built to guard. Chapter 13. A Duke Goes to Prison for Diamonds. 66 bankruptcy petitions, 1 prison sentence, and a set of his dead mother's jewels pawned with a lie, and still the houses fell. That is the ledger of the 9th Duke of Manchester, and it rewards a slow reading, because each item on it is a thing that a father had tried to prevent and could not. The wall around Helena's money held for the length of the marriage. The man it was built to contain simply went to work on everything the wall did not cover, which was, in the end, everything that mattered. He was a spendthrift of a rare and dedicated kind. He spent the greater part of his adult life evading the people he owed and trying to talk money out of the wealthy people he knew, and the courts kept a running tally of the failures. By 1918, 66 separate bankruptcy petitions had been filed against him. 66. Most men manage the humiliation of insolvency once. The Duke of Manchester turned it into a career, a decades-long routine of debts run up, creditors dodged, and fresh sources of cash found and exhausted. And through all of it, he remained a duke, received in houses, seated at good tables, permitted the presumption of a gentleman by a society slow to believe that a man of his rank could be exactly what the record said he was. His name even entered the law reports. On the American side of his tangled affairs, a case argued as Hamilton against Drogo tested whether his creditors could reach the very trust income his wife's family had walled off. The courts asked to decide whether a spendthrift could be shielded from himself by the dead hand of a Cincinnati industrialist. The wall Eugene Zimmerman had built was tested in open court, and it held. So the Duke tried the doors that were not locked. He borrowed where he could and pawned where he could not, and each expedient bought him a little time and cost him a little more of whatever was left of his name. His mother had died in 1909, and she had left behind, among other things, a tiara. Consuelo Yznaga had commissioned it from Cartier in Paris in the last years of her life, some 1,400 diamonds set in flaming hearts and scrolls, the scrolls shaped like the letter that began her name. A cash-strapped duchess had supplied her own diamonds for it, a last declaration that she still belonged at the summit even as the money ran out beneath her. On her death, the tiara passed to Helena, the second American Duchess of the house, so that the crown of the first American fortune came down onto the head of the second. 2 brides, 2 fortunes, 1 blaze of diamonds handed from the mother to the daughter she had never welcomed. Those particular stones were Helena's now, safe on her side of the family. Others of Consuelo's jewels were not so lucky. In 1935, the Duke of Manchester stood in a criminal dock. The charge was false pretenses. To raise ready cash, he had taken jewels that had belonged to his dead mother to a pawnbroker, and to get more for them than the truth would allow, he had lied about them, making false statements to secure the loan. A court considered the matter and sentenced the 9th Duke of Manchester to 9 months in Wormwood Scrubbs prison. Hold the whole picture in the mind. A duke, the head of a house that had stood for centuries, the son of a woman who had charmed kings and an emperor, locked in an English prison cell for lying to a pawnbroker about his own dead mother's diamonds. His father had drunk 1 American fortune to death. The son pawned his dead mother's jewels with a falsehood and went to jail for the falsehood. The dukedom had produced, across 2 generations, 2 men who between them managed to be a public disgrace on almost every axis a man could be measured by. Through all of it, the houses went, one by one, and the terrible detail is that 2 American fortunes could not hold a single one of them. The Irish lands were sold in 1908. Kylemore, the castle by the lake that Eugene Zimmerman had bought as a home for the couple, was mortgaged during the war and sold around 1920 to an order of Benedictine nuns, who keep it still as Kylemore Abbey. The contents of Tandragee were auctioned off in 1926. The contents of Kimbleton followed in 1949. And in 1951, the castle itself, with 50 acres, the seat the Montague family had held for more than 300 years, was sold to become Kimbolton School. Tandragee Castle went in the same decade to the founder of a company that made potato crisps, and its ducal halls became, and remain, the offices of a crisp factory. Every one of those houses is still standing today. That had always been the arrangement, and at Manchester it held twice over, the stone outlasting 2 American brides in a single bloodline. The marriage itself had ended long before the last of the houses did. It was effectively over by 1914, and the couple went through separation proceedings in 1915, again in 1921, and again in 1925, each attempt a fresh admission that nothing had changed. In November of 1931, the Duke absconded to Cuba, and the divorce is dated to that year, with a little noise in the sources over whether the final decree fell in 1931 or the year after. Within weeks, he married a stage actress named Kathleen Dawes. He had run out of the first American fortune's patience, and he simply went looking for a second wife, which was, when one steps back from it, the founding move of the whole family enterprise. Helena got out, and what she did with the rest of her life is the quietest and most dignified passage in the entire story. In 1937, she married the 10th Earl of Kintore and became the Countess of Kintore, and she lived out her years in Scotland, at Keith Hall in Aberdeenshire, comfortable, private, and free of the name that had cost her so much. She outlived the 9th Duke, who died in 1947, by 24 years. She died on the 15th of December, 1971, at the age of 93, and she was buried beside her second husband, an American industrialist's daughter who had ended her days as a Scottish countess in a quiet house, far from the ruined dukedom she had left behind. Whether that reads as survival or as exile is left, gently, to the listener. She had been handed a coronet and a cage in the same ceremony, and she had spent 70 years learning which of the two she could live inside. For decades, society had told a comforting version of the elder duchess's ruin, that Consuelo Yznaga had simply been a good woman, unlucky in a weak husband, a private sorrow, a matter of bad luck. Luck had nothing to do with it. This was the machine, a dukedom that had learned to find American girls and spend them along with their father's money, and it had just run a second time, on a second fortune, with a father's wall thrown up against it and the same outcome on the far side. Proof that the first time had been no accident at all. 2 American girls, 1 coronet, 1 outcome, and everything they had paid for still stands, empty of them. Chapter 14. The houses that outlived their buyers. Go and look for what the money bought, and you will find it, most of it, still standing, and none of them in it. The bargains these women signed were paid in full, and the proof of them is not filed in any archive. It stands in fields and on avenues, in stone that can be walked up to and touched. And the strangest way to weigh what each marriage cost is to go and stand in front of what the money actually bought. Almost all of it is still there. Almost none of it remembers them. Start in the Scottish borders, where the Tweed runs cold under the walls of Flore's castle. It is still the seat of the Dukes of Roxburgh, still a lived-in house, still the centre of an estate of some 60,500 acres, and in season anyone who buys a ticket at the gate may walk through it. The visitors move through staterooms hung with 17th century tapestries, past furniture made for the courts of French kings, past porcelain and a carpet woven for a royal gallery, and almost none of them know that they are walking through the taste of a dead American woman and the money of a Manhattan land dynasty. The rooms are May Goelet's rooms. She knocked the walls through to hang the tapestries. She stripped the heavy Victorian plaster from the ceilings and made the spaces Georgian and light. She had the electric light put in during the first winter, in 1904, and after her mother died in 1929, she brought the whole Goelet collection north out of New York and settled it into the cold borders stone. The fortune was built on Manhattan land, held and never sold, on rent gathered patiently across generations, and it went into this house, and it held. The guidebooks call the interiors among the finest in Scotland. They are the monument of a woman who spent 10 years alone inside them waiting for a child, and her name is nowhere a visitor would think to look. Go south into Derbyshire, to Kedleston, the Curzon seat, kept now by the National Trust. Mary Leiter asked to be buried there, and she is. In the memorial chapel her husband raised for her lie 2 effigies cut in white marble by Bertram McKennell. Mary as she was in the flush of her beauty, and Curzon laid beside her in his vice-regal robes, added years afterward so that the 2 of them would rest together for good, her hand clasped in his, behind an iron grille he designed himself and waited 5 years to see finished. The inscription speaks of a woman restored from illness, all but unto death, only to die. And in the same house, folded flat now because it can no longer bear its own weight, is the Peacock Dress, the cloth of gold sewn with 1,000 beetle wing eyes that she wore in the marble hall at Delhi on the arm of the Viceroy, while 4,000 guests parted to let her pass. It was given to the nation in 1997 in place of tax. It has been off display since 2022, judged more fragile than anyone had understood, unable to stand upright any longer, laid down in the dark. The gold has dulled, and the dyes have faded. The dress outlasted its wearer by more than 100 years, in exact rhyme with the way her body failed while the surface still dazzled. And they mean to show it again in 2027, long after everyone who watched her float up that hall has gone. One more English house belongs in this reckoning by right, though its buyer was only ever the emblem here, and never a subject. Blenheim Palace, the vast Marlborough seat that was sliding toward ruin until Vanderbilt Railroad money shored it up, still stands among the grandest houses in England. The woman whose fortune saved it had left the marriage, and the palace with it, long before she died. The dollars stayed in the stone. She did not. Now crossed to the houses the Manchester dukedom could not keep, because they tell the plainest version of the whole story. Kimbolton Castle in Huntingdonshire had been the Montague home since 1615, the house where Catherine of Aragon died a prisoner in 1536, and the family held it for more than 3 centuries. In 1951, its contents already dispersed. The castle and 50 acres were sold to Kimbolton School, and children have studied inside its walls ever since. Tandragee Castle in County Armagh, the family's Irish seat, the place a disapproving old duke once used to banish George Montagu and Consuelo Yznaga so as to keep them out of trouble, was sold in the 1950s to the man who founded the Tato Company, and it houses the offices of a potato crisp factory to this day. The ancestral hall of a dukedom now smells of fried potato, and Kylemore Castle in Connemara, bought by a Cincinnati oilman named Eugene Zimmerman as a home for his daughter and her ruined duke, was mortgaged through the war and sold around 1920 to an order of Benedictine nuns. It is Kylemore Abbey now, a house of prayer on the water in Connemara, a school, a crisp factory, an abbey. 2 American fortunes were poured into that single dukedom across 2 generations, and not one of its houses stayed in the family the fortunes were spent to save. The contents went first, sold off room by room across the 1920s and 40s. The pictures and the plate and the furniture carried out under the auctioneer's hammer, while the family name clung to the deeds a little longer than the family money did. Then the walls themselves went. Walk the grounds of any of them on an ordinary afternoon today, and the arithmetic is the same. A visitor buys a ticket, or a child sits a class, or a pilgrim kneels in a pew, or a clerk carries a tray past a window in an office that was once a duke's great hall, and not one of them spares a thought for the American girl whose father's money kept the roof on long enough for the building to become whatever it has become. The women bought the time. The buildings spent that time turning into something else, and they kept none of the names that had paid for it. Only one of these houses failed to outlive its buyer, and it is the one raised purely to flatter a man who never loved the woman paying for it. Boni de Castellane built the Palais Rose on the Avenue du Bois in Paris with roughly 10 million of Anna Gould's dollars, a copy in pink marble of the Grand Trianon at Versailles, put up to twice the height of the original, its facade refaced twice until he was satisfied and painted over with false marble wherever the real stone disappointed him. It was a beautiful lie, and unlike the rest of these houses, it did not last. The occupying army held it through the war. It was pulled down in 1969 and an apartment block put up in its place, and nothing of the 10 million survives on the ground where it stood. A man who had once hired the whole of the Bois de Boulogne for a single party ended owing money to his florist and his tailor, and the palace he had made of his wife's money outlived him by less than 4 decades before it too came down. What survives of Anna Gould instead is a house she chose to keep, rather than one she was spent upon. In her will, she left Lyndhurst, the Gould estate above the Hudson, to the National Trust for Historic Preservation as a memorial to her parents, and after a legal contest, the trust took the house and 67 acres. It is a museum now, open to anyone. The pink palace her fortune built is gone, and the house she gave away still stands. The plainest woman of the 5, mocked into near silence, is the only one who chose, at last, which stone would carry her memory. Stand back from the whole itinerary, and a single fact organizes it. The fortunes did precisely the work they were spent to do. They wired a castle and saved it. They built a memorial chapel and a viceregal tomb. They kept a dukedom's roofs on long enough to sell them to a school and a factory and a convent. The money did not fail. That is the hardest part of all of it to hold. The money succeeded completely. What the houses could not keep was the women who had brought it. A promise ran silently beneath all 5 of these lives, made to every heiress who ever crossed the ocean with her father's fortune written into the settlement, the one assurance the whole trade could actually keep. The house would outlive the woman who paid for it. Flaws outlived May Goelet. Kedleston outlived Mary Leiter. Kimbleton and Tandragee and Kylemore outlived both duchesses of Manchester and went on being useful to strangers who never heard their names. Even the Pink Palace, torn down, gave its ground to walls that shelter people who could not tell Anna Gould from any other ghost. The promise was kept. It was kept precisely, and it was the single promise in the entire bargain that no one had ever meant as a comfort. The stone was always going to win. That was never once in question. The only open question was how much of the woman the stone would take with it as it endured, and the answer, house by house, is set in marble effigy and sold by the guided ticket and stacked to the rafters with crisps and knelt in by praying nuns, and in every case, without exception, the answer is all of her. Chapter 15. Counting what the bargains cost. Set the ledgers side by side, and a pattern rises off the page that no single life could show. Between 1870 and 1914, 102 American women married into the British peerage alone, 6 of them rising to be duchesses. The marriage directory titled Americans, which first appeared in 1890, and ran a frank catalogue of eligible peers with their titles and their reputed incomes, counted 454 American women married into the aristocracy of Europe by the time of its 1915 edition. By the close of the century, a quarter of the House of Lords carried some American connection by blood or by marriage. The money that crossed with those women is hard to fix and easy to feel. The estimates run from around £1 billion poured into the British upper class to something on the order of 25 billion in the money of today. Whatever the true sum, this was a genuine economy, a market in rank and cash that ran the width of an ocean, and these 5 women were 5 entries in a very long book. Behind the tally stood the ordinary machinery of any market. Mothers drilled their daughters for the London season the way a firm prepares its stock for sale. A directory printed the eligible men and their reputed incomes. Lawyers drew the settlements clause by clause. And on the far shore, a class of brokers, the great hostesses who could place a girl in the right drawing room for a consideration, kept the introductions moving. 5 women, 5 stories, but the same counter, the same clerks, and the same goods carried both ways across the water, rank going west and cash going east, season after season, for 40 years. Read the 5 lives in the order they happen to fall, and something like a graded scale appears, a worsening measured in something other than money, in how much of the woman the marriage finally took. May Goelet lost her freedom and a decade of her fertility, and got a house and a kind of contentment in return. Mary Leiter lost her health and then her life, and got the grandest stage in the empire. Anna Gould lost roughly $10 million and her dignity, and got a title and a punchline. Consuelo Yznaga lost her fortune, her husband, and both her daughters, and got a dukedom that outlived all 3. And Helena Zimmerman lost the least of herself, and revealed the most, because the same coronet consumed a second American fortune a generation on, and proved that what had looked like one duchess's bad luck was in truth the working of a machine that ran the identical course twice. No single one of these stories carries that shape, only the 5 together, set in a row, let it be seen. Set against that scale, the individual question sharpens rather than dissolves. Was the sacrifice worth it for any one of them? To answer honestly means first taking back something the era stole from all of them, which is the fact that most of them chose. The story the age told itself, and the story the sentimental version still tells, is that these girls were sold, cargo shipped across the water by grasping mothers to broke and titled men. It is a comfort, and it is largely false. The buccaneers chose. May Goelet turned away some 20 suitors, princes among them, and picked a quiet Scottish soldier because she wanted him and no other, and the record says she was right to. Consuelo Yznaga, who opened the door that every one of the others walked through, brought charm where the legend imagines a fortune, and married a duke's heir on the strength of her wit and her warmth, entirely awake to the trade. Mary Leiter waited 3 years for a poor and brilliant politician she loved past reason, and paid, gladly, for the privilege of funding his climb. These women read the terms, and they signed them, agents rather than parcels. But the agency curdles, and the ledger keeps a second column beside the first. Not every hand that signed was free. Consuelo Vanderbilt was given no choice in it, locked in her room until she stopped refusing, threatened and worn down by her own mother, and the cruelest face the market ever wore is hers. Anna Gould chose and was mocked for it in the same breath, wanted for exactly one thing and ridiculed for everything else, called a monkey dressed as a princess in the newspapers and married anyway, plainly, for her dead father's robber baron millions. And the freedom to choose, where it existed, protected no one from the cost. In the cases where the choice was freest, the price came all the same. May Goelet chose wisely and paid in exile and a silent decade in the dark. Mary Leiter chose in love and paid with her body and her life at 36. Choosing was real, and it mattered, and it made these women the authors of their own bargains. It simply did not make any of them safe. That is the thing the second column records. In a hand, no wedding announcement ever printed. A scholar, writing the standard history of these marriages, gave the whole trade its hardest name and hung it in the title of the study, Gilded Prostitution. It is a brutal phrase, and it is not wholly fair to women who wanted rank as honestly and as openly as any duke wanted rent to pay his roofers. But it names the thing the paperwork was built to dress. The father's lawyers drew up elaborate settlements and trusts to fence off the income, to keep the principal out of a husband's reach, and the trusts did hold the money on paper. The purpose of the money was never in any doubt. The dollars were there to rescue the husband's house. They went to Blenheim and to Floors, and to the sinking estates of the Manchester dukedom, to roofs and rents and ancient acreage, and not to the women who had carried them across the sea. A settlement could protect the income. It could not change what the income was for. There is a particular cruelty the ledger exposes that no one of them could have named from inside her own life. Every one of these women commanded a fortune that would have made her, in any rational world, powerful. And every one of them discovered that the fortune bought her a role and then denied her the power to refuse it. Mary Leiter's money staged the grandest court in the empire and left her no power to make Curzon love his ambition less, or to walk out of the climate that was killing her. Anna Gould owned one of the largest fortunes in America, and could not stop one charming man from spending it on his mistresses until her brother caged what remained. Helena Zimmerman held wealth so large that her own father had to lock it away, power on paper that existed precisely because it would have been powerless in her hands against the man she had married. The money was immense. The powerlessness was the whole architecture of the arrangement. Not every American father was taken in, and at least one of them said so at full volume. Frank Work had watched the traffic in coronets carry off the daughters of his own class, and in 1911, an old and furious man, he denounced the entire business, the whole spectacle of American money crossing the ocean to buy titles and settle the debts of men who could not settle their own. His exact words wait for the very end of this account. What matters here is only that the anger was there at the time, spoken from inside the class that was paying the bill, and that it changed nothing whatever. The marriages went on. And the trade itself, in its deepest sense, never really closed. The particular fashion faded once the great fortunes and the old titles both lost their former value, but the exchange underneath it did not end. Rank still marries money. The coin is different, and the conversion is the same, and somewhere a person is still being spent to turn cash into standing or standing into cash, with better lawyers and worse jewellery. So, laid out end to end, was it worth it? The ledger declines to give a clean answer, and any honest verdict has to be rationed out rather than pronounced. Each of these women got exactly what she had crossed the ocean to buy. May Goelet got her saved castle and a marriage she could live inside. Mary Leiter got the summit of an empire and, at the very last, the whole of the love she had waited and suffered for. Anna Gould got her title and her long revenge and outlived every soul who had laughed at her. Consuelo Yznaga got the coronet she wanted and a seat at a king's table, even when friends had to carry in the food. Helena Zimmerman got out and closed her long life as a comfortable Scottish countess far from the wreck. The deals were honoured, the goods were delivered as promised, and the price, in every single case, was some irreplaceable part of the buyer, charged quietly after the wedding crowd had gone home and paid in a currency no settlement on earth could protect. The purchases succeeded. It was the buyers who were spent. Chapter 16. The Receipts Behind Museum Glass. In a lit case in a London museum sits a tiara of 1,400 diamonds, worn by 2 American duchesses, and it is the thing that lasted. It is called the Manchester Tiara, and Consuelo Yznaga commissioned it from Cartier in Paris in 1903, when she was already a widow and the money was already nearly gone. She supplied the stones herself, about 1,400 diamonds of her own, worked into a design of flaming hearts and graduated scrolls, and the scrolls were shaped, deliberately, like the letter that began her name, a row of jeweled initials spelling out that she was still Consuelo and still belonged where the diamonds said she did. It was a declaration made as the fortune ran out beneath her. When she died, it passed to her son's wife, Helena Zimmerman, the second American heiress to marry into the very same dukedom, so that the crown bought with the first American fortune came to sit on the head of the second, two women's money meeting on a single brow 20 years apart. And in 2007, long after the marriages that had paid for it had ended in drink and bankruptcy and divorce, and after a son had gone to prison for pawning his dead mother's jewels, the tiara was handed to the British government in place of inheritance tax and given to the Victoria and Albert Museum. It sits there now, behind glass, in a lit case, where anyone at all may go and stand and look at it. Think of the road that Tiara travelled. It began as a proud commission by a woman who had come from New York with a banjo and charm in place of a great fortune, and who had climbed, on charm alone, to the top of English society, and who was, by the time she ordered it, keeping up appearances so thin that friends carried in dishes of food so she could host a king. It passed at her death to a Cincinnati industrialist's daughter who had married that same woman's son, a serial bankrupt against whom 66 petitions were filed, and who would go to Wormwood Scrubs prison for lying to a pawnbroker about his mother's diamonds. 2 American fortunes, 2 American women, 1 small circle of stones carried from the head of the first to the head of the second. And then, when the family could no longer hold even that, surrendered to the state and set behind glass. Everything else the 2 marriages touched was spent, sold, drunk, mortgaged, or jailed for. The diamonds are what remained. From the opening of all this, the coronet was called a receipt, the proof of a purchase, the shining object, a fortune handed over to buy a place that fortune could not otherwise enter. The Manchester Tiara is the last of them and the truest. It came into the world as vanity, the final extravagance of a woman going quietly broke, and it left the family as tax collateral, the debts of the dukedom still eating its jewels 100 years after the wedding. It outlived the marriage that made it and the marriage that inherited it. It outlived both duchesses who wore it and every dollar that ever stood behind it. A crown of 1,400 diamonds, reduced in the end to a payment made to a government by a family that could no longer keep it, and set out under museum light as an object of quiet study. It is a receipt, behind glass, that has outlasted all its buyers, and there is no plainer proof left of what the whole trade really was. And there was a receipt on every one of them. May Goelet was married in white satin with a single string of pearls at her throat, $1 million of jewels heaped about her and only the pearls worn. Anna Gould's veil hung from a coronet of emeralds and diamonds that cost $40,000, proof of a purchase that everyone in the church already understood. Mary Leiter carried the wealth of Chicago into the marble halls of Delhi and wore, on the greatest night of her life, 10 pounds of cloth of gold sewn with 1,000 unblinking eyes. Each object was the same object, finally, whatever its stones. Each was a token handed across the counter, a thing that said a price had been paid and a place had been bought. And of all of them, the one that survived whole and countable and lit is the tiara of the woman who had the least money and gave the most of everything else. Stand in front of that case a moment, and the whole long anthology narrows to a single hard shape. Several hundred American women crossed an ocean, each carrying a fortune her father had built, and each brought with it a place at the summit of the oldest society on earth. Every one of them got the place she had paid for. Not one of them is left. The diamonds are. Here, and only here, all together, is what each of these 5 women bought, and what the purchase took from her in return. May Goelet bought a Scottish dukedom and a castle saved with Manhattan land money, and it cost her a decade alone in the dark of the borders, waiting for a child who would not come. Mary Leiter bought a poor man's brilliant career and the throne of an empire, and it cost her 3 hard confinements, a poisoned castle, and her life at 36. Anna Gould bought a beautiful French count and a pink marble palace razed to his own glory, and it cost her some $10 million and her name made into a joke on 2 continents. Consuelo Yznaga bought a duke and a coronet, and the open door the others walked through after her, and it cost her a husband who drank himself to death on her money, both her daughters buried before her, and every dollar she had brought. Helena Zimmerman bought the same coronet a second time, 1 generation later, and it cost her a husband jailed for pawning his own dead mother's diamonds, and a fortune her father had to cage in law so that the marriage could not devour it whole. 5 purchases, 5 receipts, 1 pattern running unbroken beneath them all, and behind the 5 of them, at the head of everything, stands the girl this account opened upon. On a November morning in 1895, an 18-year-old named Consuelo Vanderbilt sat alone behind a locked door with a footman posted outside it, and wept until her eyes had swollen shut, and then a veil was arranged to cover the swelling, and she was married to a duke she did not love. Her mother had chosen him for her. Her father's railroad fortune shored up his crumbling palace. She was the emblem the whole trade was measured against, the coerced extreme, the one bride in the story who was given no say in the trade the willing buccaneers walked into with their eyes wide open. And the thing that stands out most, setting her at the end beside all the women who did choose, is how little her want of a choice changed the shape of what came after. She was consumed exactly as they were. The palace her money saved outlived her marriage to it by many years. Chosen or forced, in love or in loathing, mocked in the papers or adored across a ballroom, every one of them paid, and every one of the houses stood. In 1911, an American father named Frank Work, who had watched his own family drawn into the traffic and hated every mile of it, said it as plainly as it has ever been said. It is time this international marrying came to a stop, for the purpose of a title and the privilege of paying the debts of so-called noblemen. He was exactly right about the purpose, and he lost. The marriages went on, and the money crossed the water, and the houses were saved. That is the whole of it, in the end. The bride and the father who signed her settlement believed they were buying a coronet, a great house, an ancient name that would outlast them and shelter the grandchildren yet to come. They were half right. The name outlasted them. The house outlasted them. They were simply never kept inside it. That was the fine print the settlements never spelled out, and the wedding announcements never carried. The clause that came due only after the crowd had dispersed and the slow years began their collection. Immortality was promised, and immortality was delivered to the stone. The women were the material it was made from. The house was not the gift. The house was the buyer, and the woman was the price. If this story held you, subscribe, because I have many more of these gilded lives to tell. And then tell me one thing. Comment where you are watching from, and tell me this. Of these 5 bargains, is there one you would have signed if you had known what it would cost her?